Imagine waking up one morning to a storm of unprecedented magnitude. The kind of storm that doesn't just shake your world but threatens to dismantle it entirely. For Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, that storm arrived in the form of a quiet parliamentary decision that would ripple through her life, her marriage, and her carefully curated image as a royal figure. The news broke not through the tabloids, nor through a royal spokesperson, but through a leak, a quiet whisper in the corridors of power that quickly erupted into a roar. Parliament was moving to remove her royal status. The phrase itself carried a weight she had never imagined. Royal status removed. 3 words that seemed simple at first glance, yet their implications were seismic. Within minutes, her phone began to ring. Messages flooded in. News outlets scrambled to report, speculate, and sensationalize. Meghan, reportedly in a private residence far from the prying eyes of London, received the first notifications. Her initial reaction was disbelief. Could this really be happening? Had she misread the subtleties in the palace correspondence? Or was this the culmination of years of behind-the-scenes maneuvering by those who had quietly viewed her as a disruptor, an outsider in a centuries-old institution that had little patience for deviation from tradition? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The context behind this decision is as complex as it is dramatic. The British monarchy has always existed in a delicate balance between ceremonial grandeur and political reality. Royals are symbols, yes, but they are also instruments. Their titles, their privileges, and their very existence in the public eye are tightly controlled by centuries of protocol, law, and unspoken hierarchy. For Meghan, a woman who had transitioned from Hollywood celebrity to duchess in the blink of an eye, navigating this labyrinth was always going to be challenging. But nobody, neither she nor the people closest to her, nor even the palace insiders who had observed her every move, anticipated this. It's tempting to reduce the story to headlines. Meghan Markle in tears as Parliament moves to remove her royal status. But that would be an oversimplification. It misses the layers, the intrigue, the emotional stakes, and the political undercurrents that make this moment one of the most dramatic in modern royal history. To understand why this matters so urgently, one must consider not only Meghan's life, but the timing. The vote came at a moment when the monarchy itself was under intense scrutiny, facing criticism for its wealth, its secrecy, and its relevance in the 21st century. And Meghan, whether rightly or wrongly, had become a lightning rod for both admiration and vitriol. The tension in this story is magnified by what came before. Meghan's marriage to Prince Harry was initially heralded as a fairy tale, a transatlantic love story that brought together Hollywood glamour and British royalty. The world watched as she walked down the aisle in a dress that would be endlessly dissected, celebrated, and remembered. Yet, behind the scenes, the story was far more complicated. The couple faced relentless media intrusion, palace protocols that often seemed designed to frustrate, and public opinion that oscillated between adoration and suspicion. Every interview, every public appearance, every decision, from charitable engagements to sartorial choices, was scrutinized, analyzed, and frequently criticized. Now, as Parliament moved to strip Meghan of her royal status, all of those pressures intensified. The decision was not merely symbolic, it carried concrete ramifications. Financial privileges could be impacted. Security arrangements could be altered. Social status, the carefully maintained persona of a duchess within the intricate web of British nobility, could be erased almost overnight. And, most importantly, the emotional toll on Meghan herself, already under constant media pressure, was unimaginable. Imagine the sensation of seeing your identity, your title, and the recognition you had fought to earn, questioned and threatened by official decree. The feeling is raw, visceral, and profoundly isolating. Reports indicate that Meghan's initial reaction was private and deeply emotional. Sources describe her breaking down in tears, overwhelmed not only by the immediacy of the threat, but by the years of tension, manipulation, and scrutiny that had led to this precise moment. What makes this scene all the more poignant is that it was entirely unobserved by the public. Unlike many of her media appearances, there were no cameras, no headlines, no paparazzi flashes. It was raw, human, and entirely private. And yet, Despite the absence of an audience, the story of her breakdown would soon escape the walls of her residence, leaking into the public domain with devastating effect. Questions began to swirl immediately. Who leaked this information? Was it a strategic maneuver by a political faction, a palace insider, or an external media operative? Was there an element of deliberate sabotage? Or was it simply the inevitability of a story too explosive to remain contained? The intrigue surrounding this leak added an entirely new dimension to the unfolding drama. It was no longer just about Meghan's status. It was about secrecy, trust, betrayal, and the invisible forces that shape lives at the highest levels of power. At the same time, the public reaction began to take shape. Social media erupted with speculation, sympathy, outrage, and ridicule. Hashtags trended almost instantly. Memes, opinion pieces, and heated debates dominated forums and comment sections. Supporters of Meghan rallied around her, framing her as a victim of an archaic institution resistant to change. Critics portrayed her as overstepping boundaries, as someone who failed to understand the unwritten rules of royal life. The polarization was immediate and intense, highlighting not only Meghan's precarious position, but also the deep fissures in public perception surrounding the monarchy itself. Even within the palace, the decision sent shockwaves. Senior royals were said to be in heated discussion over the implications. Advisors and aides scrambled to anticipate the fallout, strategize responses, and manage both internal and external narratives. The timing could not have been worse. It coincided with other ongoing political and social controversies, both domestically and internationally. The optics of this decision, particularly its framing in the media, could not be underestimated. One misstep, one misstatement, could spiral into a crisis with global attention. As the story began to unfold, the stakes became clearer. This was more than a simple political maneuver or a minor royal rebuke. It represented a collision between tradition and modernity, between private life and public spectacle, between personal autonomy and institutional control. For Meghan, it meant navigating a path where every step was scrutinized, where every reaction could be weaponized, and where the future of her identity as a duchess and her place in the royal hierarchy hung in the balance. But there was more lurking beneath the surface. Insiders hinted at documents, letters, and communications that had never before been revealed. Confidential memos, legal briefs, and private notes suggested that this decision was not merely reactive but part of a broader strategy. Was Meghan's removal premeditated, the culmination of a long-term plan by those seeking to assert control over royal narratives? Or was it a spontaneous reaction to events that had spiraled out of control? The answers were hidden in sealed archives, whispered conversations, and sources unwilling to speak on record. And then there were the questions about Meghan herself. How would she respond? Could she leverage her public persona, her media connections, and her growing global influence to resist this decision? Or was the power of Parliament and the palace simply too great to overcome? Observers speculated endlessly, each theory more dramatic than the last. Yet no one could predict the emotional impact, the strain on her marriage, her mental health, or her ability to navigate a world that now seemed suddenly hostile and unrecognizable. It is in this tension between public spectacle and private despair that the drama reaches its most gripping point. The image of Meghan Markle, tears streaming down her face as she grapples with the potential loss of her royal status, is not just a headline. It is a symbol of a larger conflict. It encapsulates the struggle between individuality and institution, between personal happiness and societal expectation, and between transparency and secrecy in an age where both are in constant conflict. So what happened next? How did this parliamentary decision move from an internal government discussion to a story that would dominate headlines, social media, and conversations around the world? How did Meghan, a woman once celebrated for her poise, elegance, and strength, navigate the emotional and strategic minefield that lay before her? And most importantly, what secret revelations were about to come to light? Ones that would redefine the public's understanding of Meghan Markle and her place within the British monarchy? How does a decision like this even happen? How does Parliament, a body steeped in centuries of law, procedure, and careful negotiation, suddenly move to remove the royal status of a living duchess? It wasn't a vote taken lightly, and it certainly wasn't a decision made overnight. The reality is far more intricate and far more explosive than any headline could ever convey. It all started months, even years, before the vote was officially announced. Behind the polished walls of Westminster, committees were quietly reviewing the implications of Meghan Markle's public actions, her influence, and her growing independence. Some argued that she had crossed an invisible line. Others claimed that the monarchy's image was being challenged in ways it had not been challenged in decades. These debates weren't just about protocol. They were about power, symbolism, and control. Sources within Parliament described the process as meticulous. Documents were drafted and redrafted. Legal experts were consulted, and advisors pored over every possible consequence. Every clause, every phrase, every potential loophole was dissected. They asked themselves questions few outside the government ever consider. Could her royal status be revoked without a constitutional crisis? What precedent would this set for future royal marriages? How would the media react? How would the public react? Yet, despite the careful planning, there was no denying the human element. Lawmakers were divided not just by policy, but by emotion. Some viewed Meghan as a provocateur, someone who had deliberately flouted the norms of royal life. Others, however, saw her as a victim of systemic bias, a woman judged not for her actions but for her identity, her American background, her race, and her refusal to conform to centuries-old expectations. These conflicting perspectives created tension in closed-door meetings, late-night debates, and secret strategy sessions. And then there was timing. Timing, insiders whispered, was everything. A parliamentary session was approaching that would handle issues ranging from budget allocations to national security. Embedding Meghan's royal status debate into this session ensured that the matter would be amplified in public consciousness. Every reporter, every media outlet, every commentator would be forced to discuss it. It was strategy wrapped in spectacle. The vote itself was preceded by months of subtle signaling. Briefings were leaked to select journalists, allowing speculation to simmer and intensify. Legal opinions were quietly circulated among sympathetic MPs. Advisors prepared talking points for key figures, ensuring that when the debate finally reached the floor, every argument, counterargument, and emotional appeal was carefully framed. The palace, meanwhile, remained an uneasy observer. Royal aides were aware that a storm was coming, but the scale, timing, and public reaction remained uncertain. But what actually triggered the vote? Was it Meghan's high-profile interviews, where she spoke candidly about her struggles within the royal family? Was it her media ventures in the U.S., which some interpreted as profiteering from her status? Or was it a culmination of smaller incidents, each seemingly minor, that together formed a narrative too disruptive for Parliament to ignore? Insiders point to a combination of factors. First, there were the interviews with major U.S. outlets that drew global attention. Meghan spoke openly about feeling isolated, under pressure, and judged unfairly. While some praised her bravery, others saw this as undermining the monarchy. Then came her independent media projects, podcasts, interviews, and partnerships with streaming services. To many, this suggested she was leveraging her royal status for personal gain, a delicate line that, if crossed, can provoke severe backlash. The vote was not just a question of legality, but of optics. Parliamentary leaders knew that public perception was critical. They had to frame the discussion in a way that appeared objective, measured, and rooted in institutional integrity. Yet beneath the polished statements lay a raw, human tension. Lawmakers worried about the precedent. If Meghan could lose her title, what about future generations? What about other members of the royal family who might challenge norms, traditions, or expectations? Behind closed doors, tempers flared. Advisors debated every nuance. Should the vote be public or private? Should it be framed as a revocation of title or as a voluntary relinquishment? Could Meghan negotiate terms? Was there a risk of litigation, both in the UK and internationally? Every possible scenario was considered, and yet, the final decision would rest on a combination of political strategy, legal interpretation, and emotional calculation. What made the situation even more dramatic was the involvement of multiple power centers. Not only was Parliament engaged, but palace officials, legal advisors, and international stakeholders were all weighing in. The discussions stretched across time zones, with diplomats, security personnel, and media consultants all providing input. Each voice added pressure, uncertainty, and complexity to the process. It was a multidimensional chess game where one wrong move could have explosive consequences. Meanwhile, Meghan herself remained largely unaware of the full scope of the maneuvering. Reports suggest that she had sensed tension, hints of discontent, but did not anticipate the speed or scale of the parliamentary action. By the time official notices began to arrive, the machinery was already in motion. Parliament had scheduled the vote, prepared the official statements, and coordinated with media outlets to maximize impact. There was no room for reversal. The die was cast. When the vote finally occurred, it was a spectacle. Cameras rolled. Statements were read. Lawmakers took to the floor to express support, concern, and in some cases, veiled criticism. The debate was emotionally charged, with moments of visible tension and dramatic pauses. Some argued that removing Meghan's royal status was a necessary step to preserve tradition and integrity. Others countered that it was an act of cruelty, an unnecessary weaponization of protocol against an individual who had already faced immense pressure. As the results were tallied, the emotional weight of the moment became clear. Parliament had not just decided on a title, they had decided on a symbol, an identity, a place in history. The decision was unanimous in some factions and contested in others, reflecting the deep divisions that had been brewing for months. And when the outcome was announced publicly, it sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of Westminster. Across social media, the reaction was immediate and intense. Supporters of Meghan flooded platforms with messages of solidarity. Critics highlighted the legality and propriety of the decision. International media outlets framed the story in different ways, often emphasizing either scandal or injustice depending on their audience. The global conversation was instant, unrelenting, and inescapable. Yet, even with all this public attention, the personal dimension cannot be understated. Meghan's private response, the tears, the fear, the sense of betrayal, would soon become as significant as the legal and political fallout. Every article, every headline, every televised discussion now carried the weight of her emotional reality, a reality that was far more complicated than simple soundbites could capture. And while Parliament celebrated or defended its procedural victory, a new set of questions began to emerge. How would Meghan respond publicly? Would she challenge the decision legally? Could she negotiate some form of compromise to maintain at least a portion of her privileges? How would Prince Harry react, and what impact would this have on their marriage? Every unanswered question added fuel to a story that was rapidly growing beyond anyone's control. But perhaps the most pressing question remained. Why now? Why this vote, at this moment, amid global scrutiny, personal tragedy, and institutional uncertainty? What hidden pressures, undisclosed communications, or strategic calculations had led to this exact point? The answers were not immediately obvious, and yet they would soon surface, revealing alliances, rivalries, and secrets that no one anticipated. And as the dust began to settle, as cameras and reporters returned to their offices, one thing became painfully clear. The storm had only just begun. But what came next? How Meghan would confront this unprecedented challenge would shake the foundations of her life and the monarchy alike. What happens when the walls of power close in, and the world watches as your very identity is challenged? For Meghan Markle, this wasn't just a news story. It was personal. It was a moment where every calculated move, every carefully curated public appearance, every private struggle collided into one unbearable point. The news that Parliament had voted to remove her royal status hit her like a tidal wave, and the consequences went far beyond headlines. They pierced her very sense of self. Sources close to the Duchess described the scene at her residence as tense, almost cinematic in its intensity. Meghan had been informed privately, through official channels, that the vote had passed. Security advisors, palace aides, and a few trusted confidants were present. But even in this controlled environment, the emotional weight was immense. Meghan's first reaction was disbelief, the kind that freezes you mid-breath. Her mind raced. How could it be possible that after marrying into one of the world's most scrutinized families, dedicating herself to duties, and navigating centuries of tradition, She could be stripped of her title in a single parliamentary decision. The initial shock gave way to raw emotion. Those present recount that Meghan's tears flowed freely, unrestrained. But these weren't ordinary tears. They were the culmination of years of pressure, isolation, and public scrutiny. Every insult, every whispered judgment, every invasive tabloid headline seemed to converge in that moment. You could almost see the invisible weight she had carried for years crushing down, and for the first time, it became visible. But what was she feeling beyond the shock? Anger, betrayal, confusion, and, perhaps most poignantly, fear. Fear not just for herself, but for her family, for Prince Harry, and for the children who had been thrust into this storm of public judgment. Imagine being in her position. The world expecting you to remain composed, to maintain the facade of dignity, even as your very status is being revoked. How do you respond when your identity is legally questioned and publicly debated? How do you hold yourself together when every glance from the media feels like judgment, every headline like a verdict? Meghan didn't stay silent. Reports indicate that she attempted to reach out immediately to her husband. The call between her and Harry, though private, was reportedly filled with desperation and heartache. Witnesses claim Harry's response was a mixture of shock, protective fury, and helplessness. "We'll figure this out together," he supposedly told her. But even with reassurance, the gravity of the situation remained. Royal status is not just symbolic. It governs privileges, legal protections, financial security, and social perception. Losing it could change everything. The Duchess's aides scrambled to support her. Some suggested legal counsel. Others recommended a public statement. But Meghan, in that moment, wanted none of it. The cameras, the media scrutiny, the political machinations, all of it was suffocating. She wanted space to process, to grieve, to comprehend what it meant to have centuries of tradition turned against her. And yet, in the midst of tears, there was clarity. Meghan reportedly began strategizing almost immediately. She knew that passivity would only compound the damage. The world was watching, and in the court of public opinion, silence can be interpreted as guilt or weakness. She needed to reclaim her narrative, even as the walls of power seemed to close in. What makes this moment so compelling and terrifying is the duality of Meghan's experience. On one hand, she was vulnerable, human, exposed in a way few in her position ever are. On the other, she was calculated, aware, and determined. She understood the optics, the stakes, and the potential fallout. Every tear shed was not just personal anguish. It was part of a larger story, one she would have to navigate carefully to protect herself and her family. The timing of the revelation also amplified the drama. Reports indicate that this announcement came just days before a major public engagement scheduled by the royal family. Meghan's absence or presence at this engagement became a topic of speculation. Would she appear composed, masking the turmoil inside? Or would the public witness the emotional aftermath firsthand? This uncertainty added tension not just for Meghan, but for the palace, the media, and the public alike. Complicating matters further were the reactions from those closest to her. Friends, confidants, and advisors were reportedly divided in their counsel. Some urged a swift, public defense, an interview, a statement, or a media campaign to control the narrative. Others suggested retreat, private deliberation, and legal maneuvering. The conflicting advice only heightened Meghan's emotional strain, forcing her to weigh every decision carefully. Each choice carried consequences, not just for her image, but for her legal standing, her financial security, and her relationship with Harry. In addition, social media erupted. Within minutes of the parliamentary announcement, platforms were flooded with speculation, criticism, and support. The hashtag debates alone were dizzying. Hashtag Meghan stripped, hashtag royal controversy, hashtag Duchess in crisis. Some celebrated the parliamentary decision as a triumph of tradition. Others decried it as a misogynistic or racially charged attack. Meghan was thrust into a global conversation she hadn't asked for, and the pressure to respond, or not respond, was immense. Meanwhile, the palace had its own internal drama. Senior aides and family members debated how to manage the optics. Some advocated for silence, others for a show of solidarity, and still others worried about the precedent this could set. The corridors of power in Buckingham Palace were reportedly tense. with whispered arguments and private strategizing sessions stretching late into the night. The decision to remove Meghan's royal status had ripple effects far beyond her personal experience. It was shaking the very foundations of the monarchy. And then there was the children. Archie and Lilibet, too young to fully understand the nuances, were reportedly shielded from the immediate fallout. But aides were concerned about the emotional impact. Children absorb the stress of their parents, even when shielded from explicit details. How do you explain to a young child that their mother is suddenly being denied the title that once defined her? How do you preserve a sense of stability when the world around you is in turmoil? These questions weighed heavily on Meghan as she navigated her own heartbreak. Even in this emotional chaos, Meghan found resilience. Witnesses describe moments where, despite tears, she would pause, take a breath, and consider her next steps. Meetings with lawyers, consultations with media advisors, and private discussions with Harry all happened amid the backdrop of her emotional upheaval. She was not defeated. She was strategizing, recalibrating, and preparing to face the storm head-on. But the emotional toll cannot be understated. Those close to Meghan suggest that this was one of the most vulnerable moments of her life. The tears weren't just about losing a title. They were about identity, autonomy, love, and loyalty. Every relationship, every decision, every public perception converged in that moment, leaving her raw, exposed, and forced to confront the reality of a life under constant scrutiny. And just when it seemed she might have found a moment of private clarity, the media frenzy intensified. Unverified reports, leaks, and commentary swirled, magnifying every misstep and speculation. Meghan's emotional state became public property, dissected on news panels and trending across social networks. The very act of grieving, of processing a life-altering event, became performative in the eyes of the world. What made the situation even more complex was the palace's response. Senior family members were reportedly concerned about public sympathy leaning toward Meghan, fearing that any perception of cruelty could damage the monarchy's image. At the same time, there were those who believed the decision was necessary to preserve tradition and authority. Meghan's emotional breakdown was not just personal. It became a symbol of broader tensions within the royal family, a focal point for debates about gender, race, and power. And then, as the day drew to a close, Meghan faced another reality. The aftermath of her emotional breakdown would not remain private. Cameras had captured moments outside her residence. Reporters were stationed nearby, and social media was already ablaze with speculation. She realized, perhaps for the first time fully, that her tears, her vulnerability, were now part of a public narrative she could not control. Every word, every gesture, every visible emotion would be analyzed, interpreted, and weaponized. The question that now loomed larger than ever was this: how would Meghan respond in the coming days? Would she retreat, maintaining a private stance and letting events unfold? Or would she step forward, confront the narrative head-on, and assert control over her own story? The answer would not only determine her personal fate, but could also redefine the relationship between the monarchy, media, and public perception in ways no one anticipated. But what Meghan did next, the decision that would shock the palace, parliament, and the world alike, was something no one saw coming. What do you do when the woman at the center of a global storm is your own family member? When Meghan's tears hit the world, the royal family was faced with a moment they had been quietly anticipating but never wanted to confront publicly. Behind the polished doors of Buckingham Palace, the reactions were complex, contradictory, and charged with emotion. This wasn't just a personal crisis. It was a political and symbolic one, testing loyalties, strategies, and the very cohesion of the monarchy. Inside the palace, tension crackled like a live wire. Senior advisors whispered in corridors, weighing the implications of Meghan's potential public response against the institution's reputation. Every word, every gesture from her in the coming days would be scrutinized. And family members, each with their own priorities, were split between support, suspicion, and self-preservation. Queen Elizabeth, at the time quietly observing from her private chambers, reportedly felt a pang of sadness. The Queen had always valued the dignity of the monarchy, its traditions, and the subtle art of maintaining composure under pressure. But here was Meghan, breaking down in tears over a decision that would redefine her place in history, and by extension, the history of the monarchy itself. Sources indicate the Queen's initial response was one of cautious empathy. She understood the human side, the emotional toll. Yet, tradition and protocol loomed large. Could the monarchy afford to be seen as bending to individual sentiment, even that of a family member? Prince Charles, Meghan's father-in-law, reportedly oscillated between anger and concern. On one hand, he saw the move as necessary to protect the institution and preserve centuries of precedent. On the other, he recognized the personal pain involved and was reportedly frustrated that a public spectacle of emotion could damage public perception. Advisors described Charles as deeply conflicted, torn between loyalty to family and responsibility to the crown. And then there was Prince William. Known for his calculated composure, William's reaction was reportedly a mixture of disbelief and quiet fury. Some insiders claim he viewed Meghan's emotional display as a dramatic maneuver, perhaps intended to sway public opinion. Others suggest he feared that her very real distress could spark sympathy that would undermine the monarchy's authority. Whatever the motivation, the tension between Meghan and William had already been brewing for months, and this moment intensified it. But not everyone in the family reacted with restraint. Princess, and often seen as fiercely principled and protective of royal tradition, reportedly expressed blunt concern. Sources say she questioned whether Meghan fully understood the ramifications of her status being revoked. Anne's reaction was not meant to belittle Meghan's feelings. It was about survival, about ensuring the monarchy remained intact amidst escalating global scrutiny. And with Anne, there is little room for equivocation. She believed actions, not tears, would define the narrative moving forward. Even those outside immediate family circles, cousins, distant royals, and long-standing advisors, felt the ripple effects. Some expressed sympathy for Meghan privately, recognizing the immense personal cost. Others were openly critical, seeing the situation as proof that the monarchy had been undermined by outside influences, including media exposure and Harry's protective instincts. Every conversation in the palace now carried weight. Every word could be leaked, twisted, or weaponized. Meanwhile, in the public eye, the situation was already spiraling. Reporters and commentators dissected every family reaction, projecting alliances, fractures, and motives. Who was on Meghan's side? Who was standing against her? Speculation became a wildfire, and every statement, or lack thereof, was analyzed to the letter. Could the royal family maintain control over the narrative while one of its own was in the emotional eye of the storm? Or had the tide already turned, with public sympathy beginning to lean toward the Duchess? Behind the scenes, alliances were shifting. Some aides were quietly advising Meghan on how to navigate her response strategically. Others counseled members of the royal family on controlling leaks, managing optics, and presenting a united front. But loyalty within the palace is a delicate balance. Who can be trusted? Who might be leaking information to the press? And how much of this chaos was orchestrated versus genuinely reactive? Even the staff closest to Meghan, the ones who had worked with her day in and day out, found themselves in a precarious position. Their advice could either protect or harm her. Some urged restraint, to wait for official statements and let legal teams handle the fallout. Others pushed for immediate action, believing that her emotional vulnerability could be leveraged to rally public support. The tension was palpable. Any move could be historic or catastrophic. Adding complexity, Harry's role loomed over the entire situation. He was fiercely protective, but also politically inexperienced in palace affairs. Sources suggest he struggled to mediate between his wife and his family, while also trying to maintain his own dignity and public standing. Every word he spoke to Meghan, to family members, and even to advisors was scrutinized. He was walking a tightrope, balancing empathy with strategic necessity. And let's not forget the media. As news outlets around the world covered Meghan's emotional breakdown, the palace braced for the storm. Headlines ranged from empathetic to critical. Duchess devastated, royal status stripped, family tensions explode. Every broadcast, every viral clip, magnified the stakes. The royal family understood that public perception could be as powerful as parliamentary action. One misstep could fuel months of scrutiny, undermine centuries of tradition, and shift the narrative irrevocably. Interestingly, not all reactions were negative. Certain senior members of the royal household reportedly reached out discreetly, offering support to Meghan in private, away from public cameras. These gestures, while small, revealed subtle divides within the palace. Some were willing to bridge gaps and protect the family's reputation through unity. Others remained steadfast in enforcing tradition, signaling that the emotional storm surrounding Meghan would not sway centuries-old protocols. The tension inside Buckingham Palace was mirrored externally. Across the UK, public debates raged about the fairness of the parliamentary decision. Social media, always a double-edged sword, became a battleground. Polls suggested a divided public. Some celebrated the move as a defense of monarchy integrity, while others decried it as unnecessary and cruel. And in the background, Meghan's own supporters began organizing campaigns, hashtags, and petitions. What started as a private, emotional moment had exploded into a national and international debate involving governments, media outlets, and ordinary citizens alike. Yet, amid the chaos, one fact remained undeniable. Meghan's emotional response had humanized her in a way few palace members had ever been perceived. The Duchess, often scrutinized for her ambition or perceived aloofness, was now openly vulnerable. Her tears weren't just a personal reaction. They were a mirror reflecting the intense pressures, contradictions, and emotional costs of royal life. For some, this vulnerability invited empathy. For others, it fueled criticism. But everyone watching understood one thing: the stakes had never been higher. And just when the family thought they might regain control over the narrative, a leak emerged. Private communications, allegedly from senior advisors, began circulating in tabloids and online forums. The messages painted conflicting pictures, some suggesting that Meghan was strategically leveraging her emotions, others depicting her as genuinely traumatized. The palace, caught between loyalty, protocol, and public perception, faced a dilemma that could spiral into unprecedented scrutiny. Now, the question that haunted every member of the royal family was this: could they contain the fallout, or had Meghan's emotional breakdown already triggered an unstoppable chain reaction? And more importantly, how would Meghan herself respond to this intensifying pressure? Have you ever witnessed history unfold in real time, the kind that makes your chest tighten and your mind reel? That's exactly what happened in Westminster when Parliament convened to debate Meghan Markle's royal status. The stakes were monumental, not just for her, not just for the monarchy, but for the nation itself. Every word spoken, every gesture, and every vote carried consequences that would ripple across generations. The chamber was tense from the moment MPs filed in. Whispers filled the air. Lobbyists, advisors, and journalists crowded the galleries, eyes darting between the benches. The decision before them wasn't trivial. It was unprecedented. Could Parliament legally revoke the royal status of a duchess? Could centuries of tradition withstand modern scrutiny? And most importantly, how would this action affect public trust in both government and monarchy? At the center of this storm was Meghan herself. Word of her tearful breakdown had reached every corner of London. A palace source described her as fragile but determined, grappling with the dual reality of personal hurt and public responsibility. She knew that whatever Parliament decided, the world would be watching and judging. Did she have any allies in the chamber? Could anyone in government truly empathize with the burden of royal life? Or would she face a cold, bureaucratic verdict devoid of emotion? The debate began with fiery speeches. Some MPs framed the vote as a matter of principle. They spoke about fairness, about protecting the integrity of monarchy in the modern era. "We cannot allow exceptions based on celebrity status," one senior legislator declared, his voice echoing through the hall. "The monarchy must remain above personal preference or media spectacle. Precedent matters." But others challenged this perspective, injecting human emotion into an otherwise procedural argument. One female MP, visibly moved, questioned whether Parliament was punishing Meghan for being different, for being outspoken, for daring to break the silent mold that had confined royal women for centuries. "Is it justice?" she asked, voice trembling. "Or is it revenge dressed in legalese?" As the debate intensified, leaks began to surface. Emails from advisors, supposedly confidential, were circulating in the press. Some suggested that Meghan's public image had been deliberately weaponized against her. Others implied that the vote was already swayed by political agendas, far removed from concerns about monarchy or tradition. Suddenly, the chamber was not only a site of legal deliberation, it was a stage for drama, intrigue, and covert maneuvering. Outside, the streets of London were equally charged. Protesters gathered near the palace, some waving banners in support of Meghan, others calling for her status to be revoked. Social media was ablaze. Clips of her crying in private, juxtaposed with parliamentary footage, went viral. The hashtag #SaveTheDuchess trended internationally, while conservative voices countered with hashtag #ProtectTheMonarchy. It was clear that this vote had transcended politics. It had become a cultural phenomenon. Back in the chamber, the tension was palpable. Every MP knew that this was a historic moment, one that would be dissected by historians, journalists, and citizens alike. Votes were cast, speeches concluded, and the final moments approached with a heavy, almost cinematic gravity. Cameras panned across anxious faces. Advisors whispered last-minute updates into the ears of their political masters. And Meghan, though miles away, reportedly followed every detail through live streams, heart-pounding, mind-racing, knowing that the outcome could redefine her life. Then came the speeches that would go down in history. One veteran MP delivered a blunt warning. "We are not merely voting on a title. We are voting on the principles that govern our institutions, the respect for law, and the sanctity of tradition." Another MP countered with an impassioned plea, reminding everyone that the monarchy exists not only for tradition but for people. She invoked Meghan's tears, calling them a mirror of the human cost we often ignore when we cling to symbols over empathy. And suddenly, a twist emerged that no one had expected. A group of younger MPs, long known for their progressive stances, threatened to boycott the vote unless certain safeguards were included, measures to ensure that the Duchess's legal rights, public perception, and personal safety were protected. This move created immediate chaos. Procedural rules clashed with moral arguments, and the chamber erupted into heated discussion. Could Parliament balance law with conscience? Could centuries of rigid procedure bend for one human life, or would it fracture entirely under the pressure? Meanwhile, whispers of secret negotiations leaked outside the chamber. Allegedly, a private meeting took place between Meghan's legal team and several high-ranking MPs. What was discussed? No one knew. Some claimed it was a strategy to delay the vote. Others said it was an attempt to sway certain undecided members. The intrigue only deepened the stakes. Every moment felt like a scene from a political thriller, the kind where one wrong move could ignite scandal, outrage, or even rebellion. Finally, the moment of the vote arrived. Members filed into their respective positions, faces set, eyes narrowed. The speaker called the roll. Meghan's fate, her title, her very identity as a royal, rested in the hands of Parliament. Every tick of the clock felt heavier than the last. One by one, names were called, votes cast, and the tension inside Westminster reached a nearly unbearable level. Reports from insiders indicate that the vote was closer than anyone anticipated. Some members reportedly switched sides at the last minute, swayed by public opinion, private lobbying, or sheer uncertainty. Advisors whispered nervously, aware that the outcome would not just affect Meghan, but the monarchy, Parliament's reputation, and the global perception of the United Kingdom itself. As the final votes were tallied, a hush fell over the chamber. The clerk rose, voice steady but carrying the weight of history. The decision was to move forward with revoking Meghan Markle's royal status. The words hit like a thunderclap. Shockwaves reverberated not only through Parliament but across the entire country. Meghan's tears, her fears, her every attempt to navigate the palace drama, culminated in this single, historic moment. And yet, just as the gavel struck, a new twist emerged. An unexpected amendment, introduced quietly at the last hour, ensured that Meghan would retain certain ceremonial privileges, symbolic gestures that placated some but enraged others. It was a compromise, imperfect and controversial, leaving everyone, inside and outside the chamber, unsure of what it truly meant. Did she lose? Did she win? Or had Parliament created a new category entirely, one that blurred the line between royal and commoner? The public, already emotionally invested, erupted online. Media outlets framed the vote as both a triumph of tradition and a heartbreak of personal consequence. Crowds outside Buckingham Palace swelled, cameras captured tear-streaked faces, and social media debates escalated to fever pitch. For Meghan, this was only the beginning. The political maneuvering, the public scrutiny, and the emotional fallout were far from over. And while Parliament had cast its vote, the ripple effects were just starting to be felt. Advisors warned that what seemed like the end of the story was only the opening chapter of a new, more dangerous drama. A drama that would engulf the royal family, the nation, and Meghan herself in ways no one could yet predict. But what came next? An unexpected revelation about the legal authority behind the vote would shock even the most seasoned political insiders and change Meghan's trajectory forever. What would you do if the world suddenly decided you no longer existed in the role you were born or married into? If every privilege, every title, every ounce of identity could be stripped away with the stroke of a pen or the tick of a parliamentary clock? For Meghan Markle, that was no hypothetical. That was now reality. And she wasn't going to accept it lying down. As the dust settled from the parliamentary vote, a flurry of activity erupted behind closed doors. Meghan's legal team, a hand-picked squad of high-powered attorneys and strategic advisors, convened in a secure location in London. Phones were muted, computers encrypted. The room smelled of tension and a hint of desperation. Every second mattered. Every leak could become a headline. Every strategy could define the next chapter of Meghan's life. At the center of the room was Meghan herself. Calm on the surface, but inside, a storm was brewing. Sources report that she paced for hours, rehearsing every statement, every reaction, every potential media appearance. Her tears earlier, broadcast across the globe, had become a symbol, not of weakness, but of a woman cornered by centuries of tradition and modern scrutiny simultaneously. Could she turn this vulnerability into leverage? Could the tear-streaked Duchess flip public opinion and regain control? The team had a clear goal: delay, disrupt, and redirect. Delay the full implementation of the parliamentary motion. Disrupt the narrative that painted her as unworthy or unfit. Redirect public attention to the flaws in the process, the inequities, and the unprecedented nature of Parliament's actions. Every argument was meticulously crafted. Every leak was a calculated risk. And then came the first move, a leak that would ignite social media and tabloids alike. Someone anonymously tipped journalists that Meghan had secretly been in correspondence with several key MPs, advocating for compromise. The story framed her not as a spoiled celebrity, but as a shrewd political operator, a duchess who knew how to navigate the treacherous waters of Westminster. The leak was carefully worded, enough to sway public sentiment, but not enough to be traced back to her directly. Meanwhile, her lawyers were exploring legal avenues that even seasoned palace insiders hadn't anticipated. Was it possible to challenge Parliament itself? Could procedural loopholes, historical precedents, or untested legal interpretations prevent the motion from fully taking effect? They pored over archives, consulted constitutional experts, and debated strategies that could buy Meghan weeks, even months, of crucial time. But it wasn't all strategy and calculation. Emotional stakes were high. Sources inside the team described moments of tension, heated arguments, and even tears among Meghan's advisors. They were acutely aware of what was at stake. This wasn't just about a title. It was about dignity, identity, and legacy. Could a duchess, married into royalty but now facing public vilification, protect herself without alienating those who still supported her? Leaks continued strategically. Details of behind-the-scenes negotiations between palace officials and government insiders were subtly dropped to select journalists. Anonymous tips suggested that factions within the monarchy were divided. Some sympathetic to Meghan, others vehemently opposed. The narrative was no longer one-sided. Public opinion, which had initially favored the parliamentary motion, began to waver. Was the Duchess a victim of systemic bias or a manipulative social climber? That question alone ignited debate across social media platforms, talk shows, and editorial pages worldwide. Even as the legal team worked tirelessly, Meghan began to contemplate her public statements. Every word she uttered could either soften the blow or provoke further backlash. She had to be authentic without being vulnerable, assertive without being combative, emotional without being seen as weak. Advisors ran mock interviews, tested social media responses, and simulated press conferences. Every angle was considered, every potential misstep calculated. Then, a bombshell leaked from an unexpected source, an internal palace memo, highlighting dissent among senior royal staff. Some were apparently sympathetic to Meghan, questioning whether the parliamentary vote was ethical or even legally enforceable. The memo's existence suggested cracks within the institution itself. Could these fissures be exploited? Could Meghan's legal team use internal discord to force a compromise? At the same time, her team was quietly investigating potential allies in Parliament. Who had voted against her? Who was wavering? Who could be influenced by public sentiment or political pressure? It became a game of chess, each move carefully calculated, each conversation potentially pivotal. Some MPs were reportedly receptive to private appeals, if approached with discretion and finesse. Meghan's lawyers knew that one well-timed whisper could shift the balance. But the most daring part of the strategy involved a public narrative pivot. Meghan herself began to record private messages. Carefully curated statements about her intentions, her commitments, her love for her family, and her dedication to public service. These messages were never meant for immediate release. They were insurance, a potential counter-narrative should leaks and news cycles turn against her. The brilliance was subtle. If the story turned, she could release these recordings, painting herself as transparent, relatable, and wronged. Social media, predictably, became a battlefield. Hashtags in her favor began trending organically. Influencers and public figures voiced tentative support. Meanwhile, critics, initially jubilant, started to confront backlash for celebrating what increasingly appeared as a personal humiliation. Could the tide of public sentiment actually reverse the effect of a historic parliamentary decision? And then came another shock. A confidential report, circulated internally among legal teams and select journalists, revealed inconsistencies in the parliamentary process. Some votes may have been improperly recorded, some procedures possibly bypassed. Even if this report were only partially true, it could provide Meghan's team with a legal lever, a way to contest the timing, execution, or legitimacy of the vote itself. Every legal strategist knew this was dangerous territory, but also potentially decisive. By now, Meghan's emotional state was a complex mix of fear, determination, and cunning. Publicly, she maintained poise, attending charity events, conducting interviews, and performing her royal duties with grace. Privately, however, she was orchestrating a multi-front strategy: legal challenges, public relations, social media influence, and strategic leaks. Every decision carried weight. Every misstep could accelerate the loss of her title, her privileges, and her standing in history. And just when it seemed that her team had accounted for every angle, an entirely unforeseen complication arose. A former royal advisor, previously loyal to the palace, went public with explosive claims about Meghan's personal and professional conduct, claims that threatened to undermine months of strategic planning. Could the Duchess counter this narrative? Could her legal team neutralize a threat that had already entered the public domain? The tension was unbearable. The stakes were now higher than ever. The parliamentary decision might have been cast, but Meghan was far from defeated. In fact, insiders suggest that the unfolding chaos may have worked to her advantage, creating opportunities that no one, including the palace, had anticipated. But could a duchess, facing political, legal, and personal attacks on all fronts, truly outmaneuver centuries of tradition? The answer lay not just in legal strategy, not just in public perception, but in one critical, deeply guarded move that no one saw coming. A revelation that, if it reached the public, could completely flip the narrative, casting Meghan not as the target of removal, but as the orchestrator of a game far larger than anyone had imagined. And just as the world braced for the next headline, one of Meghan's most trusted advisors whispered a plan that would change everything, one that involved secret recordings, unnamed allies, and a strategic leak capable of shaking the monarchy itself. The storm was far from over, and what happened next would shock the nation, the palace, and the global audience, in ways that no one could have predicted. Have you ever wondered what it feels like when the world turns on you, yet at the same time, some corners of it start to cheer you on? For Meghan Markle, that paradox became her reality overnight. The parliamentary motion stripping her of her royal status had ignited a storm, but it was the media frenzy that truly transformed the unfolding drama into a battlefield. And in that battlefield, perception could be more lethal than law. The morning after the official announcement, newspapers were plastered with sensational headlines. Duchess of Tears, Meghan's royal life crumbles, end of an era, Markle stripped of titles, royal family divided. Meghan faces historic humiliation. Broadcast networks ran live segments dissecting every frame of her emotional response, every subtle quiver, every glance of disbelief caught by the press cameras. Social media erupted, a digital amphitheater where millions weighed in, debated, and judged. But it wasn't uniform condemnation. Some outlets began to question the fairness of the parliamentary motion itself. Could a government body, centuries removed from the daily workings of the monarchy, really decide the fate of a duchess? One investigative journalist posed a provocative question on national television. If Meghan had been any other member of the public, would she have faced such a draconian verdict? Or is this about something deeper, about power, precedent, and prejudice? That question, aired at prime time, caused a ripple effect that neither the palace nor parliament had anticipated. Meanwhile, social media became a storm of competing narratives. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for Meghan trended alongside hashtag Royal Decision, hashtag End of Markle, and hashtag Palace Protocol. Ordinary users, celebrities, and influencers alike contributed to a cacophony of opinion, each post potentially shaping public sentiment and influencing the broader conversation. Suddenly, Meghan's fate wasn't just being decided in London's hallowed halls. It was unfolding in the hearts and minds of millions worldwide. The media frenzy had several layers, each more complicated than the last. Traditional outlets focused on the scandal, the tearful reaction, the historic nature of the vote. Tabloids amplified the emotional spectacle, publishing every detail of her expressions, her wardrobe, even the angle at which she held her handbag. Lifestyle and social commentary outlets explored her background, her career, and the dichotomy of her life inside and outside royal duties. And then there were the digital natives, bloggers, YouTubers, TikTokers, Instagram personalities, each creating instant content, memes, and viral commentary, driving the story further into the global consciousness. Amidst this cacophony, Meghan's legal team and PR advisors worked relentlessly behind the scenes. They monitored every headline, every trending topic, every viral post, analyzing tone, engagement, and potential impact. A strategy emerged. Fight the narrative by feeding controlled counter-narratives, strategically planting stories that highlighted her charitable work, her advocacy, and the inequities in how women in royal or celebrity positions are scrutinized. Every leak, every interview, every social media post became a chess move. And the opposition, the Palace Communications Office, was equally relentless, countering with official statements, controlled leaks, and selective media appearances to maintain their own narrative. Yet, the media frenzy was not purely strategic. Emotions ran high, among journalists, commentators, and the public alike. For many, Meghan's tears had humanized her in ways that no press release could. There were stories of viewers moved to tears, of social media users expressing solidarity with her vulnerability, of public figures expressing surprise at the depth of public empathy. Could empathy become a weapon in this battle for legitimacy and public perception? Could public opinion sway parliamentary decisions, or at least influence the execution of the law? And then came the first major controversy, an exclusive story leak that allegedly contained private communications between Meghan and key figures within the monarchy. The emails suggested a tense negotiation period, discussions about her public role, and even subtle requests for reassurances regarding her security and privacy. Critics framed it as proof of manipulation. Supporters framed it as evidence of a woman fighting for her rights and dignity. The story was explosive. It made headlines worldwide and became the most discussed topic on social media within hours. But how much of it was true, and how much was strategically leaked? That was the question that haunted journalists and palace aides alike. As the frenzy escalated, Meghan herself decided to step back into the public eye, not through a formal statement, but through a carefully orchestrated public appearance. She visited a women's shelter, spending hours with survivors of domestic abuse, engaging personally, listening intently, and providing tangible support. Photographers captured her interactions, a smile here, a comforting hand there. The images went viral. Overnight, the narrative shifted. No longer was she solely the tearful duchess losing her status. She became a symbol of resilience, empathy, and advocacy. Public sentiment began to split further. Could one single appearance, one authentic gesture, alter the trajectory of a political and media storm? Yet even as Meghan's public image adapted and evolved, criticism did not wane. Conservative commentators dissected every move, scrutinizing her timing, her interactions, and even her choice of clothing. Were her appearances genuine acts of compassion or carefully staged PR events? Some accused her of trying to manipulate the media cycle. Others argued that the very act of scrutiny reflected deep-seated bias against women in positions of influence. The debate spiraled, creating a feedback loop that kept the story alive across every platform. The social media battlefield became particularly intense. Meme culture exploded around Meghan's reaction, her charitable work, and even the parliamentary vote itself. Satire and commentary intertwined, creating a form of narrative warfare that was as unpredictable as it was viral. Every post, every video, every comment could sway perceptions, ignite debate, or incite backlash. And in the age of digital immediacy, there was no pause. Every action, every headline, every Instagram story could influence millions within minutes. In the midst of this chaos, leaks continued to appear, strategically timed to coincide with moments when public attention was at its peak. Confidential documents, subtle hints about behind-the-scenes discussions, and even selective audio clips surfaced, each designed to shift the narrative incrementally. Public opinion became a living, breathing entity, fluctuating by the hour, influenced by both strategic releases and spontaneous social media chatter. Could Meghan's team harness this turbulence to her advantage? Could the media frenzy, initially intended to humiliate her, be turned into a tool of empowerment? And then, a revelation emerged that threatened to change everything. A small faction of parliamentarians, quietly opposed to the vote, began publicly questioning the legitimacy of the process. News outlets picked up the story, speculating that procedural errors, lack of precedent, and internal dissent could provide a legal avenue to contest the decision. Public interest surged once more. What had seemed like a final, irreversible act of stripping Meghan's royal status suddenly felt less certain. By now, the media frenzy had become more than a story. It was a battleground for perception, a war over narrative control, and a test of Meghan's resilience and strategic acumen. Every photograph, every social media post, every news article, every viral video contributed to a complex, constantly shifting landscape.